Know when to start.
37, probably. Mics are on, anyway.
The mics are on?
Yeah, we're on.
Shall we start?
Yeah.
Okay, so welcome, a warm welcome to this panel, which is titled Time is Ticking, the Markets Are Watching, Reforming EU Fiscal Rules. I'm James Kanter. I'm the founder and editor of the EU Scream Politics podcast, and I'm a former Dow Jones, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times, Paris, and Brussels correspondent. Let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Michal Horváth is finance minister of the Slovak Republic. He was previously chief economist of the National Bank of Slovakia, and he was among founding members of a council for budget responsibility created in response to the sovereign debt crisis. Madis Müller is our central banker. He is chairman of the Bank of Estonia and a member of the ECB's governing council. He's formerly been an advisor to the Estonian Prime Minister and to the World Bank. Jeromin Zettelmeyer is the director of the think tank Bruegel. Prior to that, he was deputy director of the Strategy and Policy Review Department at the IMF. He's also served as DG for Economic Policy at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Jozef Kausich is our private sector voice on the panel. He is Chief Executive Officer at VUB, the second largest bank in Slovakia, which is part of the Intesa Sao Paulo group. He formerly led the Slovenian banka Intesa Sao Paulo. That's our panel. But before we start, a quick scene setter, as this can be a techie topic. I'm glad to see so many people in the room. I have been an EU watcher for a long time, long enough to remember Romano Prodi calling the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the Euro rulebook that we're discussing today, something like a stupidity pact for its rigidities. That was 21 years ago. And sure enough, Eurozone states very quickly began to break the 3% deficit limit and the 60% debt marker. Germany and France evaded sanctions, as has every single violator of the rules since then. Over time, the rules sprouted more and more rules, and the whole thing started to look like an out-of-control garden weed. And it's worth remembering, the Euro crisis was stopped not by this rule book, but by Mario Draghi and the ECB. So to bring it right up to date, the European Commission is proposing a brand new rule book now. And the new rules would be tailored to each member state in the hopes that governments will follow or comply with them better. But there are concerns. Will much longer adjustment periods and bespoke plans negotiated with Brussels be enforceable enough to keep frugally minded countries happy, the Eurozone stable, and for that matter, big spending populist governments in check? All of that can be existential for the EU. At the same time, we need states to tackle the climate crisis and build up defenses in a time of war. That is existential too. So there are really big issues at play here. It's not just dry technocracy. Now, I want to get everyone talking as quickly as possible. So here's a question for a quick response round. 1 minute, if you can do it. Would you put the accent right now, the emphasis, more on compliance, as I just described it, or more on enforcement at this stage of the Eurozone's life? I'm going to start with Jeromin, as I stole this idea from him, who has written a great deal on the topic. Jeromin, your minute.
Okay. So many people would not immediately think that there's any difference between enforcement and compliance, right? You would think of compliance being the result of enforcement. The difference is that when you comply, you worry about, on the one hand, the costs of non-compliance, and that's about enforcement, and then about the benefits of compliance, which is, does it make sense for you to comply, or are there costs from complying too, right? So you're doing something stupid, to quote Prodi, for your economy in the name of some rule that makes no sense for you. So the strategy of this proposed reform is to work on that side of the equation, right? So there's a little bit on enforcement too in the new proposal. So they're trying to make enforcement a little more credible, for example, by having smaller and earlier fines, right? Because the big fines are just simply not handed out. But the main idea is indeed to make the rules less, quote-unquote, stupid, in the sense that they are more tailored to the country situation, that they go back to the basics, which is to restore or maintain debt sustainability, and otherwise they try not to interfere too much with the country's choices. And the hope is that these more reasonable rules will then also be complied with more.
Okay, great. So you're sort of a believer that we can get to greater compliance. Michal, can I turn to you on that topic? Compliance or enforcement at this stage of the Eurozone's life?
Yeah, I also tend to think that enforcement is one way of achieving compliance, and I think that a certain level of enforcement has to stay in the system. But I agree, I subscribe to what Jeromin has said about the fact that if the rules make sense, you're more likely to get compliance. That's perfectly fine. The interesting question for me is which level enforcement should be happening. And in the past, we've seen that enforcement at the EU level has not really delivered for all kinds of reasons. And there's a legitimate question whether enforcement should not be brought closer to the national level. And that's why we have been, obviously, I mean, given that I'm a founder of a fiscal council at the national level, I can't say anything else but argue for a greater role of national fiscal councils in actually fostering national ownership, but also making sure the enforcement is there. And the enforcement is there where you have most information about fiscal issues.
Great. I would like to come back to the fiscal council idea. Thanks. A little bit more enforcement in your response than from Jeromin. Very interesting.
National level.
National.
Full disclosure, I was on the scientific advisory council of his fiscal council, so I'm biased in the same direction as Michal here.
Thank you for the clarification. Madis, can I turn to you on this particular question? 1 minute.
Yes. When you first asked the question, actually it wasn't clear to me how to differentiate really between the two. But if you look at it in a way that compliance comes with ownership of the plans that fiscal and reform plans that the governments submit, then of course you need national ownership, and hopefully that's what will also drive the compliance. But having said that, I really think there needs to be also solid enforcement in case things start slipping, then because the experience just shows that that is also necessary.
Thank you. Jozef, on this question, you're the private banker, you see the markets moving.
Yeah, enforcement for me is really well connected with the penalties. And the penalties is for me a very negative motivation. And the past has really shown that the kind of penalties really didn't help a lot to be more fiscal discipline. What about the motivation, which I called, and speak about that, accessibility, for instance, to the investment funds. So once you are not there, so you cannot have the access to EU funds, or very conditional or limited. So this is more of an approach that sounds to me more, and which are like more than just simple penalties.
Thank you. That's really interesting about funds, because once we get into funds, we have new mechanisms to dangle a carrot and to take that carrot away when needs be. So perhaps we'll come back to that.
And then don't forget the markets are watching as well. So disregarding how they achieve it, there is also that part. And they are as well very critical to the situation, what happens around the countries.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to what I'm thinking of really as our first proper round, but I would invite you to ask questions when you feel like it as well, and respond to each other. But I'll turn to you, Michal. I mean, tell me more about how you see the Brussels proposal, and how much of how you see it sort of depends on who will be the finance minister of your country in the future. I mean, after all, what I said in my introduction was that strong fiscal discipline can be a controller of big spending anti-EU populists. Slovakia may soon have such a government.
Right. No, my position on this is completely independent of politics. In your in your introduction, you nicely laid out all the weaknesses of the existing system. And I think there's a lot to like about this proposal. When you look at it purely at a technical level, it goes in the right direction in many respects. It's forward-looking. You have the medium-term orientation. You have sort of indebtedness at the core of the system. You have the operational rule is through an expenditure benchmark. So this is also the kind of system that we have been trying to build in Slovakia. So at long last, the two things seem to be converging towards the same kind of philosophy. And obviously, there are big issues still open at the EU level in the discussions. But these core elements, I think, are going to survive no matter what. It's more about balancing out the different features and all kinds of flexibilities people want to build around the rules. But otherwise, the core of it is something that we can certainly support.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps I'll try and come back to you on politics a bit later, perhaps with mixed success. Madis, can I turn to you? In my introduction, I mentioned how it was indeed the ECB that finally put an end to the euro crisis. Mario Draghi said he would do what it takes. With that in mind, with that background, I mean, to what degree do fiscal rule books really even matter?
Absolutely, they matter. They matter, first of all, because I think the situation in which we find ourselves right now is that the level of indebtedness of European governments is clearly too high. We have an average of about 90% of GDP for the euro area in terms of government debt. That's 50% above the 60% level that comes from the Stability and Growth Pact. So it is a problem that the level of debt is so high. It is a problem, and in that sense, I think the focus of the Commission's proposal is appropriate in the sense that it's aiming at the gradual, at least, reduction in indebtedness of the European governments. Of course, you can argue about details, which we will do, I'm sure. But then it also matters for a central banker who is concerned about inflation, because it's just so much easier to get the inflation under control when the fiscal and monetary policy are supporting each other and moving in the same direction. And this is not really what we are also seeing at the moment. Having better rules that sort of encourage or support more counter-cyclical fiscal policy also definitely would help with inflation. And it's not only a problem for the central bank, but of course it's a problem for the economy and everyone, really.
Thank you. Yep. And Jeromin, if I can turn to you. I mean, you're our expert voice on this panel. As I said, you've written a lot about this. You've spoken a lot about it. What do you make of what Madis and Michal have just said in their first responses?
I mean, they both said eminently reasonable things, so I fundamentally agree with them, but I think their responses sort of understate the extent to which the proposal is controversial, right? The proposal is still quite controversial. It's not clear that it will actually be passed, that there will be a political agreement by the end of the year, which is the objective. And the nature of the disagreement is on the core, actually, which has to do with this country-by-country approach, and the way that the debt reduction target or the medium-term fiscal adjustment targets are determined under the proposal is through a methodology called debt sustainability analysis. And this methodology is, according to the Commission's proposal, completely in the hands of the European Commission. And so the worry of some member states, and I understand to some extent I share this worry, is that this methodology is going to be a black box that the Commission controls, no one really understands what's in it, and then, you know, we know the Commission, even though it's a technocratic body, is not completely free from political pressure. And so there is a concern that then, in the end, the methodology will be subject to political pressure, that particularly big countries will get maybe an easier deal because the Commission fiddles within its black box. There was also a concern initially that the methodology would actually not result in very ambitious debt adjustment, right? So what we have done at Bruegel in the last few months is we have actually recreated the methodology. We have backward engineered the methodology with a little bit of help of the Commission, but not very much. It's now public, so you can download it from our website. We have the code posted, a Python code on a GitHub folder. And so what we found are two things. First, this view that the methodology wasn't going to be very ambitious is wrong. So I also had that view, just from the wording of the proposal. It seemed an unambitious wording. You know, we're going to start and bend the debt curve down after 4 to 7 years. You know, it sort of seemed very unambitious. In fact, because the debt has to fall with high probability after these 4 to 7 years, it actually means you have to do a lot of fiscal adjustment until then. So even though the fiscal adjustment is not as high as the current rules would prescribe, and as you said at the beginning, that's partly why we have this reform, right? Because the current rules at this point are unrealistic. So you cannot apply them, you dodge them, you would fudge them, right? And so better you have a new system that's a little less ambitious, but actually stands a chance of compliance. But it's still very tough, right? So ballpark, you know, the Commission assumes that in the next 2 years there is going to be quite a lot of fiscal adjustment, maybe 1.5–2% of GDP on average. And then on top of that, the average fiscal adjustment under these new rules would be about another 2–2.5% of GDP. So it's sort of massive fiscal adjustment, not as high.
And can I ask you, what in your data,
yeah,
what state was facing, even under the new rules, the steepest curve, the toughest climb?
It's not surprising that the countries that have both large deficits today and have high debt would face the steepest. Now, Italy, Belgium, France. Okay, so this is the first point. And then the second point, so what member states essentially forced the Commission to do, to take account of this concern that the Commission might manipulate the methodology, is to create a second tier of rules that sits sort of below that methodology, just in case, right? So there's a sort of particularly a minimum debt reduction requirement. And that is problematic, I think, because it sort of steps back from this country-specific approach, right? It essentially returns to the old rules. Having said that, because the new approach, the rules, the sustainability analysis is actually quite tough, for the most part, these so-called safeguards that are being imposed on the systems would not be binding. All right, at least in the first application. But there are some really important exceptions. One very big exception is France. So it would force France into a completely unrealistic fiscal adjustment. So this wasn't thought through very well, or maybe it was thought through, but clearly it's not going to pass in this form.
Great. Well, let's come back to those safeguards and what's behind that, and
Sure.
whether they do indeed undo the entire rationale
Right.
for the new rules. Jozef, I mean, let's go back to public debt and the solvency of sovereigns and how those are important factors in the way that you run your business. Maybe you can talk us a little bit through that and how, you know, important it is, how important the private sector is when it comes to disciplining public debt.
I mean, there is a clear relationship between the sovereign and the banks, the private sectors. So because the solvency of the banks, to a large extent, really depends and is related to the solvency of the government. And that's not just for the reason that in many countries as well, the banks hold this government debt into the books. When I just imagine a scale from, let's say, 25, so the bottom level to the top level, 70, 75, let's say, percent of the ownership of the total government debt in the country. So Slovakia is somewhere in the middle. So bank owns like 51%. Then when it comes to the lower scales, it's more Estonia, I understood, 25%, and then the top is Czech Republic and Italy and so on. And of course, the which is reflected through the public debt is also related to the of the bank itself, because we are holding the portfolio. And then you have this, very famous effect, which was episode many times in the past, and this is this famous doom loop, which we know at least from the which we know at least from the Greece and then the debt crisis, which was evolved afterwards, which perfectly says, I mean, weak country means weak banks, or weak banks means as well, I mean, weak countries. And maybe on the example of our bank, because we are not just the buyer of public debt, but because also issuer of the bonds, I could reflect that a little bit here, because as we are owning that and if the public risk goes upwards, so that means more risky, so also that the market perceives those bonds a little bit, I mean, different. Investors demand then higher returns on those, and when the interest rates goes up, so we have to reevaluate those bonds into our portfolios, and that means that it eats a lot of our capital. Again, capital is the absolutely basic instrument, so we have capital adequacies which are even controlled by the national banks, which is absolutely inevitable for the economic growth. So that means because we are lending through the capital. If the banks doesn't have capital or do not have capital, so basically they are limited in lending. So that I would say that is the first implication.
And so here we are discussing how some people in Brussels, essentially bureaucrats, are coming up with new rules that are meant to ensure the stability of the Eurozone. How much confidence does that fill you with when it comes to what you've just been doing?
Look, at least from what I know, it should be much more simplified. So I remember the old one, and the old one is really like a complex of multiple indicators which are somehow measured in time. Then we have different layers on that. So what I understood and what was also mentioned, it's basically about the reduction of the debt path, and that through some election periods. So each government gets a really reasonable chance to deal with that throughout the years. Of course, it will depend a little bit on the electional cycle, because normally you are more prudent at the very beginning and then before the election, so you release a little bit. But, we must be confident, because these two really private and general markets are linked together. When I just continue, because we are also issuer of our bonds, which are very linked as well, to the price of the government bonds, because we cannot refinance ourselves cheaper than the government itself. And every year we have at least 2 tranches of the so-called covered bonds. So that means each tranche around 500 million euro, and we see right now the prices. So we see right now how the sovereign of the country is as well priced, and the prices go up. Last year I was able at the level of 0.5%. Today I'm at the level of 4% for 5 years. But, that's not the end. Okay, we will bear the cost, let's say, but that has even a reflection in our other loans, which we provide to the commercial sector. So, for instance, mortgage loans. So just to believe that if the prices in the future will go down as, by the monetary policy, well, it's not so sure, because still, if the government risk stays high, so we will have it reflected as well in our covered bonds, which will pass to our customers.
Thank you. That's really clear. Thank you. And I'm very glad that you brought up this topic of election cycles, because, and Michal, maybe I can turn to you. Part of what these new rules are doing is to think about adjustments over a 4-year period, over even a 7-year period, even over a 14 to 17-year period, depending on how you look at the new rule book that's being proposed. Should somehow the rules be more tightly configured to an election cycle in order to give governments an incentive to do the kind of compliance that Jozef was just talking about? Is that an important component of how fiscal governance should work?
I cannot see how that could work at the EU level, with so many countries, so many electoral cycles that sort of tend to happen randomly. But more importantly, perhaps, the question of fiscal sustainability is something that we should have a consensus around. Yes. At the national level. So you can argue about loads of things in fiscal policy, but at least some of the basic principles should be adhered to across governments. And in that regard, I don't mind the horizon, and generally the expectation within the framework would be that there is a kind of a rolling 4-year planning horizon, which is just fine. It's
okay, great. And if I could stay with you for a moment, as Jeromin was describing, I mean, any regulation is going to need to go through the whole EU legislative machinery. So maybe you can give us a sense of how close or how far away we are in that process. I mean, what's the mood among your fellow finance ministers?
My impression, and I guess many of my colleagues, ministerial colleagues, would share this, is that the progress has been fairly slow so far. When my very short stint as finance minister started in May, we were at a certain point, and I even in our last meeting in Santiago, I have not really felt we have moved ahead that much. And given that I was also involved in the previous revision of the Stability and Growth Pact back 10 years ago, which took many sittings.
I'm sorry, I hope you didn't take offense from my description of the weed that was growing out of control.
No. There's no reason for me to take offense at any of these things. So to sum it up, in 10 years ago, these things took a long time, lots of discussions, lots of sort of square brackets to agree around, and we are not at that stage yet, and it's October. And the elections are in May, so if we want to have a workable set of rules for 2025, we have to have something approved early next year, given that the fiscal cycle, the budgetary cycle for 2025 starts in the spring of 24. So by that time, we would need a lot more clarity about the rules that we're going to work against or with.
I'll come back to you, if I may, about the politics of that among the finance ministers. But I want to turn to you, Madis. And it sort of comes back to something that Jozef was saying, and that I tried to highlight, which is that it's long been said that monetary union can only really function if you have some sort of fiscal union, right? And that implies pooling of resources on some level. And it's not really, the pooling of resources, it's not a huge conversation right now, but perhaps it should be, because giving EU money from a joint fund as a reward for compliance, right, might be one way of making fiscal rules work better.
Well, there is, of course, the big debate whether we need a central fiscal capacity or sort of a central budget for the euro area in order for the monetary union to work better. I think for sure we need better fiscal policies, be it through a central budget or just making sure that governments manage their fiscal policies in a responsible manner. Of course, there is a bit of a central budget with all the EU funds already that are being distributed to governments, plus the facilities that to support reform that have been set up in the last couple of years. But it's not clear to me that it is absolutely necessary that we need a big central budget for the euro area.
Right, and your reluctance about, because I mean, a lot of people do see that as being, one of the, if we're going to have fiscal rules that really work, well, we need a pot of money to say, you're just not going to get it. And those regional funds that you said already exist and so on and so forth, yes, while substantial, they don't really amount to something like the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which really did provide certain incentives for governments around the EU to pay attention to what the central authorities were saying in Brussels. So, I mean, what's not to like about that kind of approach? And I should say that the RRF, this fund, is going to run out soon.
Yes, well, that's what I was referring to as well when I was speaking of the recent initiatives. But I think effectively, whether you hold back some of the resources that a government was supposed to receive from, say, the RRF or a similar facility, or just apply fines, I think in a way it's sort of a similar result. And we were just discussing that, so it's not obvious that necessarily the fines work. Although I think there should be some form of an enforcement. I'm not really against a solution as you suggest, in a sense that some funds could be held back if a government is acting fiscally irresponsibly. But it's not the same thing to say that we need a huge central budget necessarily. I think there should be something, and we also have something. When it comes to enforcement, I think you also referred to the importance of markets. So I also do believe in market discipline still, especially now that the interest rates are higher. It is becoming really a burden to governments. We have an average for the next year, I believe it's about 0.7% of GDP is the interest expense only for the euro area governments. The biggest percentage for one country is 4%, which already definitely is something that the finance minister will feel, and the government will feel as a factor that puts a lot of pressure on the government budget.
And yet I would go back to what I was saying in my introduction, which is that while I agree that that dynamic can often be the most effective, right, the market forces that you were describing, we also face these existential questions. We have a war that we need to finance. There may be Republicans in the White House who leave Europe much more isolated and in need to find funds to fight that war. And we have a climate crisis which seems to be accelerating with each year. So it seems to me that this is a time to think more creatively, perhaps, about how a central fund or pooling could be of benefit, not only for the fiscal rules, but
well, that's what the RRF does also in parts, but I think you're right in the sense that we need to think carefully how to really be able to make all those investments and support the green transition, digitalization. We need to increase the defense spending in Europe. That's being done, and it does put a lot of pressure on government budgets. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind that the level of debt is already as high as it is, and we also need to deal with that. So definitely, there's a need to find a fine balance. I think the overall goal of the European Commission's proposal also goes in that direction. Personally, I would be really interested in seeing the Bruegel analysis in more detail, because I'm not sure if it's really that ambitious in terms of debt reduction, but perhaps we can
No, I think that's a great opportunity to turn back to Jeromin. I mean, perhaps I could invite you to engage with that question about how we afford these other existential factors, but also whether markets themselves are enough of a discipline here.
Okay, so let me make one point on markets and enforcement and one point on how the hell do we finance all this and at the same time keep debt sustainable, right? So on the first point of markets and enforcement, there typically market discipline, even in countries, regions of the world that are not in a monetary union, and so where this fiscal and monetary authorities are at the same level, it's typically a little bumpy, right, market enforcement, because there is rarely a smooth relationship between interest rates going up and higher deficits, but rather, markets tolerate things for a while and then suddenly they will lose out of patience, right? So it's not very easy. Now, before that, and so that is the fundamental reason why we think in Europe we need the fiscal rules on top of market enforcement. So for example, markets were asleep at the wheel during the 2000s, right? So now there's one important innovation that the ECB decided last summer, which actually might make market enforcement more effective, I think. And I think also that, in a sense, the innovation and the rules, the new proposal, jive well with that instrument. And so I'm referring to the so-called transmission protection instrument, where basically the ECB says, look, if your spreads get out of control, so if you suffer a run on your national debt, we will intervene as the ECB, provided that we agree that spreads are inappropriately high, but only under certain circumstances. And the two important eligibility conditions are, first, you have to comply with the rules. Second, your debt has to be sustainable, right? And so here, what the ECB has done, arguably, if this works well, is it has single-handedly created an enforcement instrument for the fiscal rules, which is far more powerful than anything that the Commission or the Council have come up with in the past, right? This is essentially the ECB controlling the dosage of market enforcement and then saying, we're going to pull up that pivot. If you guys are out of control, we're not going to bail you out. You know, the wrath of the markets will be in you, but if you are, then... And, you know, so to avoid that situation, just stick to the rules, okay? So that is very helpful, I think. Now, in the new regime with this new proposal, if anything, this will work a little better with the new proposal than on the old rules. And the reason is that this idea of debt sustainability, which is another criterion that the ECB applies to decide whether it will intervene or not, is now part and parcel of the new rules, which it was not in the past. So compliance with the new rules now will mean that you're hitting sort of the two critical conditions for ECB help, right? And so in that sense, this will help with enforcement. So, but it has nothing to do with the design of that reform itself, right? Because, you know, again, this is something the ECB just happened to decide to do in parallel. Okay, then on the issue of can we afford all this and how do we reconcile things? So what is completely clear is that we will need fiscal adjustment of the non-defense, non-climate investment portions of the budget, right? We cannot do it without fiscal adjustment. And that is true even if we were to create a central fiscal capacity at the EU level, because ultimately the debt that is issued by that central fiscal capacity needs to be repaid from somewhere, right? And the resources of the European Union are finite. It will ultimately draw on the same economic activity that revenues at the member state levels draws on. So this central fiscal capacity is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for debt creation. There will have to be some fiscal adjustment. At the same time, and this is a super important distinction, it doesn't mean that we cannot debt finance some of these important things, right? Because debt sustainability doesn't mean debt cannot temporarily go up if this is linked to, for example, a temporary investment program, right? Debt sustainability means that there is underlying fiscal adjustment. So when the investment program stops, after, say, a 7-year horizon, 10-year horizon, or something like that, you then know it will be declining. And markets understand that you are doing the work to actually repay that additional debt that you are taking up. And so that's, I think, where the compromise should lie. And now to just quickly get back to these safeguards, the current so-called safeguards destroy that possibility. And so that's one of the reasons why they cannot stand. Right? They are too much of a straitjacket. They would have to be at least qualified by saying that if you incur debt for the purposes of financing, you know, these priority expenditures over a limited point of time, it's okay for the debt to go up, provided that you're doing the underlying fiscal adjustment at the same time.
Right. And this is very interesting about these safeguards. They were brought in because of pressure from countries that are known by journalists as the frugals, right? You know, these are often northern states. These are certainly, they include Germany and the Netherlands. And they tend to want to keep a closer eye on debt levels. Now, I'll turn to you, Michal. The politics of why the economic governance reform is stuck. I wanted to invite you just to talk a little bit more to that, because we have a very interesting situation with this piece of legislation going through in Brussels. At least it's very interesting for Brussels watchers, because we have the Spanish, you know, a southern country holding the EU presidency, but meanwhile, we have this kind of legislation that's sort of moving through that the frugal countries and the northerners are very, very mindful of. Is that dynamic what is sort of holding things up a little bit?
Yeah, I think it would be too much of an expectation for me to be an expert on EU politics in such a short time. I don't. To be honest, the fact that a certain country holds a presidency, it should not matter that much for how the agenda is. Obviously, you can nudge things in a little bit in a certain direction, but it's. They're there to manage an agenda that is.
It's possibly journalists in Brussels who exaggerate the mistrust that the Spanish presidency engenders when the Germans are. Yeah, but I take to your point.
But I think Jeromin laid out the key sticking points very clearly. There is, on the one hand, a concern among the let's call them Northerners. I mean, okay, that's a bit of a stereotype.
Yeah.
About backloading of fiscal effort. So if you leave too much flexibility, if there isn't really sufficient amount of clarity or control over what qualifies as investment or reform, you might very well get into a situation where there will be only promises of future adjustment that are never delivered. And on the other hand, you have the concerns that were the rules too tight, it would prevent some useful investment. So to be honest, I'm not really a big fan of golden rules and things like that, because they also present policymakers with bad incentives in my understanding. That if you allow flexibility for investment, they just never get the social reforms done and so on. So it's very. I mean, the difficult bit is to do the other side of the bargain. But once you allow for flexibility, you take away the incentive to do much on the on those fronts where actually work has to be done at the national level.
Right, and link that, if you will, to some of the work you've done and to your view that independent fiscal oversight can be a really helpful element as we go ahead, as we go forward. Yes. We know that we have the European Fiscal Board, but perhaps they should have more power. Is that where you would?
That's certainly a part of the game. In fact, there was a proposal by the IMF as well to take the Fiscal Board out of the Commission structures where they are currently based and create a self-standing institution, which is certainly something I would subscribe to. I think I
was the co-author of that paper.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Before
so, I didn't know that, so it wasn't. But it's great. I think so. The role of the EFB would be, I think, mainly in maintaining a level playing field. So I think at that level of governance, these independent institutions should be safeguarding a certain equal treatment across countries. We've heard that. In the past, and perhaps even in the new system, it's not really guaranteed. Maybe the bigger countries would get an easier ride. So this independent assessment at the EU level could safeguard the fact that there is equal treatment. But independent oversight at the national level is important, because that's where people have most information about fiscal issues. There is no way the Commission or even the EFB could effectively have a sort of an equal exchange of views with the national authority, whereas the local IFI is in a position to do that.
Okay. Thank you. Now I'm going to look around the room because we've got 8.5 minutes left, and I want to see a show of hands if there are any questions. And I know there's some eminent thinkers in the room themselves. So,
There's a question there.
Do we have a question?
Yep.
I know who you are, but perhaps you can introduce...
Former President of Estonia, Kersti Kaljulaid. I was listening to Madis, and you said, maybe withholding structural funds funding for those who misbehave. What to do with net payers is my question in that case. And then I have this question that if we have a kind of euro area budget, this will really make Europe two-speed, far more than anything else. And of course, this budget, we will run into deficits because there is an inevitable and very important spending everywhere in Europe. And this might be the good thing, because then, we have euro area budget, and the markets will punish euro accordingly, which is good. But for that, it needs to be at least, I would say, 10% of the GDP. Can you really imagine those outside of the euro area in the EU accepting anything like that?
Right. Madis, I'll turn to you first to respond to your former president.
Oh, that's. I think these are very, very good questions, especially the one about withholding some payments from the sort of structural funds. That's not that easy. From the RF, you could imagine maybe it being relatively easier, but in terms of having the European Commission issue bonds and finance some joint activities, I think what's really important is what was already mentioned, that effectively it has to be paid. The repayments have to be financed by the same sort of economies of the euro area. It's just in a way it's the same government debt just being allocated at the European level, sort of hiding some of the level of indebtedness that we have in member states. And when it comes to investments and trying to exclude some of the good investments that we feel right now are the most important ones, then I think the problem is then why we need to be careful is something that was referred to already the last discussion yesterday on monetary policy, where there was a question whether, for example, education would be an investment in your people, in your future. I think health expenditures would be an investment into the health of your population. So it's all really investment, and it's very difficult to say where do you stop and what do you exclude, what you don't exclude. And since we are at the end concerned about the overall level of indebtedness, I think we need to be very careful with such exclusions. And just to make a last point on the relative strictness of the rules, then the approach right now seems to be that the rules are relatively stricter on countries with higher levels of debt. Mm-hmm. I think we might actually want to have a little bit more in terms of a guiding framework also for countries that do not yet maybe have such a high level of debt. I'm thinking also of my own country, where in the coming years I think we expect to see budget deficits up to 4% of GDP. The new framework would say that you, as the debt level right now for Estonia, for example, is still quite low, you need to keep it at 3% of GDP. But if you constantly have a 3% deficit, you're on a very bad trajectory, and you don't really want that. And I think there still should be a way to encourage counter-cyclical fiscal policy also for governments that do not yet have such a high debt level.
I mean, the short-term and the long-term goals here are very, very difficult to balance. And Jozef, I mean, what do you make of this discussion? I mean, there's been a lot of sort of abstract policy-making discussion over the last 10 to 15 minutes, but for you, I mean, when you hear this, I mean, which bits of it really appeal to you as a private bank?
I mean, for me, that everything needs to be done in a perfect balance, because what I think that it affects basically three areas, the whole discussion. The first is the economy, and nobody can really expect that within, 1 year, somebody will now cut the deficit from 6%, but nobody's even expecting that. I think what the markets more do expect is that each country has a reasonable consolidation strategy, which is even long-term. And I also heard that there are also some, let's say, not exceptions, but they are even in that strategy could be implicated as well some risk to the future, which are connected with paying the pensions and with the aging of the population and so on. So that's the first. The second, of course, is the policy, because behind policies are also some philosophies, some thinking. I mean, each government in each of the countries are really very different. I think that they got a great opportunity to look at that, speaking about that strategy from a long-term point of view. So from the election period of 4 years, it's really on them what they do prefer to do, either on the income side or on the expenditure side. And then it's, of course, the social aspect, because what we don't want to have in our countries are some disbalance, social disbalance. Nobody wants to see the people on the street, strikes and so on. So everything in the life, everything is about the balance of the stakeholders' approach and the risk that we are facing.
Thank you. Jeromin, I'm just going to look around the room again did we have a question over here? Yeah, hi. Could you just introduce yourself? And
Daniel Horniak from Bloomberg News. Let me please use this opportunity to ask question Mr. Kausich about possible bank tax in Slovakia. I'm sure you heard of Robert Fico's pledge to impose a bank tax if he returns to power, basically to take away half of banks' profits. If you could share with us your opinion, what kind of impact that would have on banking sector in Slovakia, like lending capacity, or if it could also impact, for example, banks' interest in Slovak government bonds in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that's the discussion, not just in Slovakia, but all around Europe. I mean, what I understood from the European countries, already half of the countries have introduced this sort of a tax. Even this is not somehow unified, because we as well in Intesa have many countries which are affected, some calculated from the increase of the revenue, so the income, some of the balance sheet. So even here, it's not I mean, each government approaches a different target. But actually, that can leave, and I have to say something to it, because capital is very important for the banks. And the source of internal capital of the banks are really profits. And, you know, in the last 3 years, in particular in Slovakia, 60% of the whole profits remain and return in the internal capital, because we have created a sort of a reserve for the future. And just 20% of those profits were paid to our, let's say, shareholders, like this is from the banking, I mean, perspective. So taxation for me is something absolutely short term, because we are living in this effect, and I would even not say that we are facing some extraordinary profits, because yes, compared to 2020 when we have extraordinarily low profits, so yes, there is of course some difference. But actually we are creating a reserve for the future, which probably we will unfortunately not that have. And this is connected with the lending connected with the growth of the economy as well as a driver. The second one is the portfolios of the bonds which we have on our books, but also provisions which we have to create to our future, because the negative possible cycle would have impacts on our borrowers. And last but not least, increase of the borrowing. So I do not see nothing possible of the tax, honestly.
Thank you, Bloomberg, for bringing in the political dimension, which is always there. Time is up, and I am going to take the liberty as the moderator to allow a last question. And
thank you very much for the exception. I'm Peter Kazimir. I'm the governor of Central Bank of Slovakia, and I served as a finance minister together with Schäuble and with Wolfgang Schäuble in Orgard, after GLF, So, and from my perspective, this new finance minister council is totally different animal now, So. And what I'm afraid that the fiscal discipline in certain countries is not political category anymore, and in certain countries the fiscal discipline has no political value domestically, and the reason, the reasoning behind is, that the rationale behind is that, for example, the spending has become the omnipotential remedy, to deal with all pains in this world, And of course, Commission and also monetary policy was very helpful to this heretic approach. So this is about the mood, this is about the environment where we try to come up with the new rules now. And finally, just okay, you have mentioned this the compliance enforcement, but you skip the categories like discretion, which used to be labeled as flexibility, output gap and structural terms, all these nasty words which could kill any best proposal you can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to see you again, not standing outside of the Europa building in the freezing cold during a 3-day summit. Yeah, I'm going to let Jeromin wrap this up with a final word. I think what we've heard is that, of course, I mean, for me, this just reinforced the ideas that public debt and approaches to public debt and finances, it is shaped by different countries and cultures. And I think that's one takeaway here. And another is that, yes, we're always going to have this degree of fiscal harmonization, but hard-coded rules are not politically feasible. Anyway, that's my wrap-up. Jeromin, do you have a final thought, particularly after what we heard from Peter Casimir?
So I think that in an environment where we have massive competing pressures, we cannot afford a system which is rules-based in a simple-minded way. Because when you're doing that, you're essentially giving away scope to use fiscal policy to do good things. And we have massive pressure to do good things with fiscal policy. So we need to strike smart compromises between fiscal orthodoxy, bringing the debt down, and giving flexibility to fiscal policy. Now, the main problem, like you just pointed out, is to make sure that this flexibility is not abused. And here, I think the design of this new proposal offers a good approach because it's based on this idea that you essentially commit to a maximum expenditure path over a certain period, and you cannot get out of that, right? So in that sense, that discretion on the day-to-day implementation is limited. The main worry here is about discretion and political influence in the design of this. And here, in my view, my countrymen, and let's make it clear, these are not just the Bruegels, this is single-handedly Germany, in my view, have gone completely down the wrong road in trying to build this little safeguard cage around the methodology of the Commission, instead of forcing the Commission to put its methodology on the table, to have a discussion on that methodology, to iron out the weaknesses, and then to put it on the desk of every finance minister in Europe and civil society too, right? That should be the way to stop the Commission from abusing its
That's a perfect note. That's a perfect note to end on. Don't destroy what we have on the table and what's been put forward. Let's work through the kinks and the knots and tease it out so we have something like a workable system. Let's have a big round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for making a tough topic so lively.
Thank you. Thanks.